Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have James Furbush on the show. James is the VP of Marketing at AccessOne and host of the Modern Patient Experience podcast. James has a job like many marketers out there. He doesn't market to marketers and therefore can't double dip his professional content with his personal brand content. We talk about that and also talk about how a VP of marketing and team of one in James is able to run a show in both audio and video format on a twice per month cadence with repurposed content. Overall, podcasting has been a good amount of work and taken a good amount of James's time, but he's going to tell you how it's also helped him become a better marketer and improve his career. Enjoy the show. All right, so James, I feel that sometimes people forget that there are marketers who don't primarily talk to other B2B marketers or salespeople or revenue people as their audience. When you look on LinkedIn, you see a lot of podcasts and posts about marketing or sales, but you do a podcast that's not on marketing. So what's it like to dedicate so much of your time to an activity that is much more company industry focused than personal brand focused, where you don't really get that double dip of creating content for the business that's also content for James?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Justin. I actually look at it in some ways that it actually does help my brand. So in some ways, I'm a little bit envious of marketers who get to do podcasting for marketers because they can double dip on LinkedIn. It's a very efficient thing. For me, the people on LinkedIn who are marketers obviously don't care about healthcare podcasts. And so I don't obviously sometimes share the clips that I do in a lot of the content. But for me personally, I do think it helps my personal brand. And what I mean by that is, one of the big reasons that I decided to do the podcast was I was interviewing for a job as a head of content for a financial services company. This was back in 2020, the summer. Last 2 years are all a little bit of a blur. But one of the things that they said, the feedback that I got was that my content creation was very, very word, very just blogs, white papers, classic content development, that I didn't have a lot of experience doing video and other forms of media. And so I actually use the podcast in some ways to sort of challenge myself, what I'm capable of. And I think actually that does very much feed into my personal brand. Maybe not so much outwardly on LinkedIn, but if I decide to go to another company and bring those skills, I mean, that's all part of my personal brand. Having that podcast, having the ability to say that I've run a podcast and I've done all of this stuff, I think it's very valuable for my brand if I bring that to another company. It's just not always so overt in how I would leverage that on LinkedIn.
Yeah, for sure. So you're getting that experience, but you don't necessarily get to broadcast it like some others may get to.
And I certainly could. Don't get me wrong. I could pimp my podcast all day, every day on LinkedIn if I wanted to. I just don't think the crowd that I run with sometimes now on LinkedIn cares a lot about how patients in a hospital system are paying their bills or how a CEO thinks about certain things. So I actually just consciously choose not to share those clips, mostly just because I think my audience on LinkedIn probably doesn't care about that stuff. I think they probably do care about how I execute the podcast, how I basically run it as a one-person team, kind of doing the soup to nuts from finding guests, doing the production, distributing it, things like that. And that I probably could do a better job of sharing that knowledge that I've accrued with LinkedIn. But at some point, I got to sleep at some point, and there's always trade-offs for how much content you can put out in the world. So
let me ask you this question. I'm curious. A lot of marketers who have found themselves in the bucket of being like martech marketers really lean into that, right? Because it's easier. Their audience, like yours, is already marketers and salespeople. And so when you go out and talk about those activities, you kind of already have that captive audience of your peers. Some marketers out there really lean into their space. So maybe someone is a cybersecurity marketer and they plan on being that for life. I work with a lot of marketers in my world who may work at an industry specific company with an industry specific podcast, like healthcare is a great example, but maybe don't see themselves being a lifelong healthcare tech marketer. And so they don't lean that way necessarily with their personal brand. I'm curious, have you thought about ever leaning in and saying, I'm a healthcare tech marketer, or do you prefer to keep LinkedIn where you're doing, you're engaging more with the community, and then your marketing efforts on behalf of the company are industry specific? Just talk to me about your thought process around balancing that.
Yeah, honestly, I wish I were that shrewd in my career progression. I mean, I think for me, I have one of those minds. The way my mind works is I'm just like deeply curious about a lot of different things. And so in some ways that's been good as a journalist, as an interviewer, as a podcast host. I feel like just like my innate curiosity, you probably know this, right? It's like you start an interview and you have like the sort of script in your head where it might go, and within 15 minutes it veers off to the left and you're like, oh shit, I am not prepared for this. I gotta, now pivot and kind of do it on the spot. So my brain has allowed me to kind of, I think, do really well in that regard. In some ways though, it's been a downside because I'm like, sure, I'll go do, marketing and industrial manufacturing. Like that sounds cool. I'll go do healthcare marketing. Like, I think I can make like healthcare cool and fun, even though in some ways it's like not. And it's like, then I'm bouncing around to like craft beer and things like that. So in some ways from how I look for roles and things like that, I haven't really limited myself. I think if I had like niched down and just if I, maybe now that I've done healthcare marketing at Athena and now I'm back in healthcare marketing, maybe now is the time to niche down and just admit to myself that I'm like a healthcare marketer. But then, that's like you closing opportunities. And I've always been, one who, I don't know, I want to have windows open everywhere because you never know where, you might find joy in unexpected places. And I think like limiting myself just to focus on healthcare, I don't know, maybe cybersecurity is cool. Like maybe I'll try that next. I don't know. But, it's a hard balance to strike, I think, for sure. Like without a doubt.
And going to different industries is interesting, especially if you are going to either position yourself as a podcast host or as someone who can execute on it or what have you. And so when you're working in kind of a niche space, and for you right now, it's revenue and finance and patient experience in healthcare, how are you using your journalism background to run a podcast in such a complex space that you may not be a traditional subject matter expert in?
Also, another good question. I have learned, the fine art of the open-ended question. It's more important to get my guest to talk than it is for me to like, I think when I run the podcast, it's almost like I want to be invisible in some ways. And I think a lot of it is, okay, my journalism background, that training is in doing sort of a lot of the upfront preparation. So it's spending time to, I mean, in some ways it's Googling, I think in a lot of ways, but like spending that time, right? Like you're reading hundreds of articles and interviews. If I'm doing a podcast and I know who my guest is going to be on, it's like I'm, doing the upfront research. What has that organization been up to like lately, right? So where are they in the news? What are they doing? What initiatives are they launching? So what is same with the guest and compiling all of that so that, and really then be to organize it and kind of create like a dossier so that if the interview does, deviate from the script and sort of where we think we're initially going to take it, it's like, I'm well prepared to like lob out like, good follow-up questions and good open-ended questions. And also when you do it enough, like, too, right? Like the art of, keeping your mouth shut. Cause oftentimes, I think there's this tendency for interviewing, to sort of fill that void, or jump in and, like you would talk to someone at a party. But when you're interviewing someone, I mean, essentially what you're trying to do is get them to talk and get them to share information. And the best way to do that is you want to kind of lead them a little bit, but really give them, a great open-ended question that they're gonna, can answer a million different ways, and then keep quiet and let them keep talking so that, they might. I often find when you keep quiet, it's like that often can be the time where someone offers up the most interesting information. That's like, okay, man, if I had jumped in and interrupted you, like I wouldn't have got that like solid nugget that is going to be my 30-second sound clip. And I think just that career journalism prepares you to do that interviewing, right? It prepares you to do the research. It prepares you to do the interviewing. It prepares you to do all that and to think about then like how you're going to take that story and immediately or take that interview and immediately sort of find that story. I mean, I could almost now do a podcast and like in my head as I'm doing the interview, it's like, I'm like, okay, that's my headline. Like that's my soundbite. This is the number one takeaway. And so I can like do the interview. And as I'm doing it, I'm like already building like the assets in my head and stuff like that. And I think like that journalism career, like prepares me to be able to do that where, it's a lot more than just, kind of doing an interview and asking like the same 5 questions and things like that.
And I want to expand on it a little bit. So like I mentioned, I would say 75% of our customers are more similar to your background, or your role, working in complex technologies, maybe not selling to sales and marketing folks, but selling to, whether it's people in the healthcare space or, as I mentioned, selling to CISOs and heads of security or whatever it may be. And then marketing gets tasked with the podcast. I'm curious, do you ever get any sense of imposter syndrome when you're tasked with speaking to MDs, CEOs, COOs at these healthcare-based organizations?
Yes and no. Early in my career, when I first started at Athena Health, so before I was at Q Squared and now AccessOne, I started my marketing career at Athena Health. It's a large, $1.5 billion healthcare tech company here in the Boston area. And I started, this was way back in 2013. They hired me to run blogs and social media, and then really just like drank from the fire hose and started doing like event content and all this stuff. And I think like at first it'd be like, oh, I'm going to this event and I've got to shake hands with a CEO of a $8-9 billion health system. And you get like really nervous. You're like, what the hell am I going to talk to this guy about? Like I am a complete fraud. Like I do not belong here. But I think the other thing about journalism is like you build connections with people. So it's like you learn how to make small talk and build rapport and get people to open up to you, right? Like you develop sources and you get people who in some ways want to talk to you and share information. And I think I kind of bring that over and you realize that, yes, they're the CEO of a large health system or whatever, but they're like, they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like us. And they have, interests outside of work. You kind of like build a connection over whatever it may be, right? Like they like soccer or they like football or they like to go for runs and you kind of build that relationship and eventually that imposter syndrome of like, I can't believe I have no business being in the same room as these people eventually kind of disappears. And, it's like funny because I remember like the first time I started, when I was interviewing at Athena Health, they had this program where they had Harvard Business School professors actually writing for their blog, and they were paying them like a ton of money. And my an interview assignment was to like take this article from a Harvard Business School professor, and that it was like, make this better. And I'm like, it's a Harvard Business School professor. Like, I cannot edit them. Like, this is absurd. But then you do that, and you're like, to be able to initially give them that feedback, you realize that like even Harvard Business School professors, even, people really high above the food chain, they want feedback, they're willing to take it. And I think you just have to trust that like you've built and developed skills that like make you valuable, maybe not paid like a CEO, but, certainly you bring a lot to the table, to help a company grow and achieve their revenue goals and things like that. And so then, that gives you the confidence to certainly for me, like when I started Q Squared, I mean, they gave me the confidence to be like, absolutely, I can start a podcast and I'm going to like line up these great guests and that have C-suite titles and probably had no business, probably wanting to be on a podcast that didn't exist. But yeah, you do it first, but I think the more you're in that environment, the easier it is to realize that, you belong at the table. If you're good at what you do, like you should have a seat at the table, even if, that seat at the table is just like, you're the podcast person, but like people are still going to look at you as that expert and like want your advice and, want to bring you into the conversations and things like that. So yeah, I'm fortunate that I've been doing it at least long enough that like, I sort of now, I'm kind of like over the fear or the intimidation of like interviewing people who are, CEOs of companies and things like that. I think, fortunately for me, I'm kind of past that point.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just something that we see a lot is people want to start a podcast and then they're faced with this difficulty of, okay, are we going to leverage CEO at our organization? We'll use your organization, for example, AccessOne. CEOs, I'm sure, extremely busy.
Yeah.
By having the CEO be the host of the podcast, you then become very reliant on someone who may not have the time. And marketing wants to have ownership, but they're nervous, don't feel qualified to be the ones actually running these interviews and having these industry-based conversations. So I think, taking more of that journalistic approach versus subject matter expert approach, because there's not a right way to do this, right? You can be more of a moderator, prompter, question asker than having to be someone who, is an MD in the healthcare space talking specifically about what they know and interviewing someone similar. I think that there is a delineation there, and I think there's room at the table depending on how you do it. For anyone, whether it is a subject matter expert wanting to run a podcast or marketing wanting to be more journalistic in nature.
Oh my God. I agonized over whether or not I should host the podcast, like as I was pulling my plan together and all that. And, because part of it is like, I've got like the face for radio for sure. And, like a lot of other people, I probably hate the sound of my own voice. And so part of it's like, I don't necessarily want to be like the face and voice of this podcast. But then like you start to think about it, you're like, well, what's the alternative? And so for marketing teams, yeah, it's a big decision, because if you ask your CEO to host it, like your CEO has to have buy-in, right? It's very rare for most CEOs at a company. Very rarely do you get like a David Cancel from Drift, right? Who is like, sure, I'll be on 17 podcasts. I will be the host of them. I'm fully bought in. I would say that the experience for most companies, that is not the case. And so that's something you have to manage. And it's hard enough as a one-person team for me, Justin, to be able to keep the production involved in even a bi-monthly, so twice a month podcast, doing everything from booking guests, doing the research, recording, doing the production and getting it out the door, distributing. It's brutal. I mean, it is like, maybe I was foolish in thinking that I could, definitely handle that with all my other responsibilities. And I've been able to kind of do that. But if you then add in the friction of like, now you've got someone else who you have to manage it and work around their schedule and they're not fully bought in, you're almost like setting yourself up for failure right out of the get-go. And so for me, like, I weighed that, like, should I have a subject matter expert? I think the interviews would be better, but then that's but then that leads to I'm not going to be as agile. I can't control as much of the process. And so there's no, like you said, there's no right or wrong answer. For me, the right answer was I wanted to remain agile and just control as much of the process as I could for as long as I could until maybe I had resources to like outsource the production and some of the other stuff. And I think my background gave me the confidence to be able to say, maybe I'm not as qualified as, say, like a subject matter expert, like my CEO or someone else, but I can still do 80%. And maybe that 80% with being agile is good enough. But yeah, I would encourage anyone who's thinking about starting a podcast to seriously weigh like those two things. Like, because then if you have the SME, maybe you're only doing one podcast a month. And is that frequency enough? Maybe then you're only doing one every 2 months. And unless your CEO or that subject matter expert really has buy-in and is like gung-ho about it, that can be a tough hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, 80% of something is more than 100% of nothing, right? So you're kind of balancing, and I see it all the time, where people will struggle to record because marketing is not in charge of the podcast function. They're reliant on CEO, CTO, some sort of high, COO, like some sort of higher ranking official who, for one reason or another, is slower to the upkeep, even if it's not buying. It's just strict time or attention to detail. Not to say marketing doesn't have attention to detail, but marketing also a lot of times will understand more the need to ship things.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who may be an SME in a very, difficult space where, let's just say someone's building rocket ships, right? And they, in their world, everything needs to be perfect or else the rocket ship explodes. And so the amount of time and thought that would go into a podcast episode about rocket ships being run by a scientist who's building rocket ships versus the marketing team for those rocket ships may be a little bit different. And so, yeah, I love that maybe I'm not 100% of what the SME would be, but it's better than the alternative.
Yeah. And for me, right, like the part of the podcast that's so great is that I wanted to, for me, drive awareness through tapping into my guests' networks and their own sort of innate ego of like promoting themselves, right? So like in some ways, healthcare, when you get to that level of like CEO, and it's probably maybe the same in a lot of industries, I do think there's a little bit of ego involved in like, they want to be seen as like an industry leader, but it's particularly pronounced in healthcare. Like it's a weird, you go to some of these conferences and it is like the ego and the people who want to be all thought of in a high light. And I was like, I want to take advantage of that. And so, for me, I was kind of like, I don't need a subject matter expert. Like I just need a couple good guests and I can like use those guests' name to get other guests' name. And then eventually, for me, I'm like, if the content isn't great all the way around, like it's kind of okay. Cause like I could chop it up and like, maybe the 30-second, LinkedIn clip is more important than the full 40-minute podcast interview that I would do with them anyways. And so I do think being smart about how you chop up the podcast and leverage it, almost sometimes matters more than like, whether I'm the host or the SME and all of that. Because again, like, if you're in marketing, you want to be agile, you can always have that SME on like when they're free and, come on and kind of leverage like that internal resource. Like if I wanted to have my CEO on the podcast, I could absolutely be like, hey, I'm light on guests for like this week. Like you got like, I want you to be the guest on the podcast and like, let's come and talk, promote the company or do whatever. I think there's ways you can leverage those SMEs like as a guest mix without necessarily having them be like a full-time part of the show.
Oh, that's a great idea. And something that I've actually been working on a lot with our customers who are in similar positions as you are, marketing, running the podcast. I was actually just having a conversation this week with someone who's in the data space, and they're only bringing on C-level executives or VPs from really large organizations, and it has made it a little bit difficult for them to always find guests. And so what she's going to be doing is doing a 3 to 4 part interview series with the CEO on specific topics. And so those will then fill any times where she doesn't have guests. It's also allowing the CEO to get involved in the show, be a face of the show, but not be the face of the show, which is her role. So love that point too.
I love that idea.
I want to
like special topics. I'm definitely gonna steal that. Like, write a little note to myself.
Yeah, and another pointer, if you want it, is if you do get the CEO's time, block off like an hour and a half and do 2 to 3 of them in one sitting. They can be a little bit shorter. You know, our interviews with guests are usually like 30 to 45 minutes, like today's episode with you is going to be. But when we do it internally, my business partner Tristan and I will talk to each other. We have those like 15 minutes and we record a handful of them all at once on a variety of topics. And then you can fill your content calendar with additional episodes and you're highlighting yourself. There's a lot of benefits to doing that. And the customers who I've brought that idea up to have been extremely receptive, which has been fun for me because then I feel like I have a good idea and, you know,
I love it too because like you think about sometimes like your CEO has certain things that they care about at any given time. And if you can capture that, it's like, okay, we'll turn into an audio podcast for 15 minutes, just like talking about topic A, B, C, and D. And then it's like, now you've got like blog posts on those topics. And yeah, that's, again, it's so obvious when you put it like that, like just lump all the things that they care about, cover it off in an hour and a half in like different segments, and like you're done. It's so efficient. It's such a great way to do it.
And I know that efficiency is something that is very near and dear to your heart, James. So that leads me and kind of dovetails me into the next piece of this conversation that I want to have. So one of my favorite questions to ask on a prep call, and I asked this of you, was just because I have an idea of what I think we should talk about on this podcast, I would love to hear what you think that we should talk about on this podcast. So I said, James, you know, my podcast is, then the people who listen are people on teams, marketing teams of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 at B2B organizations who care about podcasting or who run podcasting. So I asked you, I said, you know, what would you want to talk to them about? And you said that it's possible to do a podcast on no budget or minimal budget with one person. What did you mean by that?
I mean, yeah, it is possible. When you say it like that, it sounds insane, but it is possible. So yeah. So, I do everything, right? So like the podcast, the modern patient experience, you know, if you think about, I guess, the life cycle, right? It's like booking the guests, lining up the guests, coordinating all of that, recording. So setting up the recording, doing the recording, then taking that and then turning that recording into a podcast and then distributing said podcast out into the world. And so for me, yeah, I do all of those stages by myself, and I'm able to do it, honestly, I think because there are so many good tools out there that I've found that allow me to just, like, I think our audio quality, it's not like studio professional grade, but like, you know, I pay, I think it's like $15 a month for Riverside. You know, it's like Squadcast, or it's a recording studio. And I like it because, you know, Riverside, I like a lot. They have some nifty tools where it overcomes like internet latency, which sometimes my guests don't have good internet. And sometimes like I don't have good internet, but it has a way to still record, like overcome that. So I'm like, that's a no-brainer because all these interviews that I do are virtual. So it's like, I've got my recording studio. Then I take all that audio. Once I've done the recording, Riverside has some nice little tools where I can create a finished version, like a side-by-side video, or just like, it also has this thing where it'll pick up who's talking and just, it's like on the video portion, it'll show just the person who's talking. But they've got these like automated tools where it's like I just click like 3 or 4 buttons and it like creates a nice sounding, almost like video that I can work with. Then I take that video and I upload it to Descript. Descript is a lifesaver. So I am not like a B2B influencer by any stretch of the imagination. I am not paid by Descript, but I will tell you, if you are thinking about doing a podcast, just pay the $30 or the whatever it is, Descript per month. That tool is so good. I don't even get reimbursed by my company. I just pay for it out of pocket. It has made my life so much easier because Descript is like you upload the video and audio and it creates a transcript. And so now you've got a transcript and you can like edit video clips like based on the transcript. So I can like highlight video clips and like export those. And now I've got this like great 30-second clip. And so for someone who's not like super great at video or audio, like Descript has these just like amazing tools that make it like stupidly easy for like any noob to like figure out how to do this. And then from there, I've got like templates set up in Canva, and I can like drop the videos and change the headlines, and then like that's done. And so, I mean, honestly, the production of a lot of the assets, and I think from every podcast I record, it's like a 40-minute, let's say 30 to 40-minute, full episode. I can basically create like a full YouTube video, 2 or 3, 30-second to 1-minute soundbite clips, the audio that goes on Spotify and things like that. I mean, it's a really full suite of like content assets that I'm like able to create with this library. And I'm in a good day, if I have a half a day, maybe 3/4 of a day to sit down and focus, I mean, I can bang out all of this stuff with these tools, like doing the episode. So yeah, it is absolutely possible, but you got to find the right tools and you got to create a system that keeps yourself honest. Cause frankly, for me, like there's no deadline. So like if an episode doesn't get out the door, it's on me, but I have to like hold myself accountable to like make sure I'm doing all of these things. So yeah, it is possible. And I mean, I'm living proof that like, you can, if you care enough to do it and you have a little bit of time, you can certainly do it even with, for me, where I'm juggling a bunch of other hats. I mean, I can still kind of do a decent podcast, get 2 episodes out the door every month, get a ton of stuff for social, distribute it. Yeah, it's entirely possible.
And one thing that obviously you touched on a few times is just the sheer amount of time that it takes to do the podcast. And as a one-person team, you only have but so much time. Why is the podcast something that you feel is worth this time investment? Yeah.
Well, so for me, right, so like half of marketing is like zigging when other people are zagging, right? And so, in some ways, like if someone launches another podcast in marketing, that podcast has got to be like really good or like very focused to stand out, because there's a billion podcasts like in the just marketing tech arena. I mean, frankly, in healthcare though, like there aren't a ton of good podcasts. Like part of it was when I was doing the research, it was like, all right, there are like doctor influencers who have like their own podcast, but like that's not necessarily like our audience. There are like trade publications are doing like paid podcasts where like a vendor will pay to have their CEO go on for like 15 minutes to like huck, the company's benefits and value prop or whatever. And I'm like, that's not necessarily what we're doing either. So when I looked at like in healthcare, I was like, I don't know, there's actually like a great green space to bring something to market that is different, that our competitors are not doing, that will maybe help us stand out. And so for me, it was just taking a lot of the stuff that people are already doing in martech and bringing it to like my industry, where I think there was just a lot of green space to like leverage that. And I'm like, frankly, like, I don't want to download another ebook. And like, certainly, it's that same mentality of like, I've got Zoom info, I have all the emails, I don't need to create an ebook to download. Right. It's the same shit that like Chris Walker talks about all the time, but it's kind of true in healthcare, which is, our buyers, it's a buying committee and they're very long deal cycles. And we know who all of our buyers and the accounts are. So it's like, I don't need to do gated stuff to like figure out who might buy our product. Like, I know who's going to buy our product. I just need something that can like engage them, have something to keep them engaged, nurture them. I think, my sales guy summed it up best. One of my sales guys that I partnered with closely, he summed it up best when he said, I wish it was as easy to schedule a demo as it is to get a prospect to be a guest on your podcast. And for him, like, I've had this great partner who's like worked his accounts where he's like talking to his accounts and, he's working them and like he can't get a demo. And then he's like, hey, we've got this podcast. Do you want to be on it? And inevitably all the people he asks, they're like, yes, just let me know when I can be on it. But now, like, I've given David, like, that is a differentiator for like my sales guy who now he can build a relationship, right? Like now he's got a reason to follow up because now his prospect or his account has been on the podcast. And now it's like, hey, like your podcast is live. Like, let's keep talking. And so it gives those sales people in our company like another reason to reach out to their accountants in a way that is different than just, all the other cold emails that they are getting. And so I kind of looked at that whole landscape and to me, it was like, it's a no-brainer from a lot of those boxes from a small bootstrap company that like needs to stand out and needs to have, better velocity in a sort of selling process. And so for me, it just checked all those boxes. And so when I look at it, it's absolutely worth the effort and time it takes to do all that and to see sort of the reaction as well. I think seeing the reaction to it has sort of just proven out what I thought was, that even though like we're not going to have this massive audience and be in the top 1% of downloads and yada yada, but that like it could still bring value to our kind of revenue engine, the sales and marketing process, from a marketing standpoint, from a content standpoint, from a sales cycle standpoint. So for me, it's absolutely worth it when you weigh it against, all the things that it actually helps within a company.
Yeah, it's so fascinating for me. So over the years, I've worked in content creation for events. We've done video. We've built out written content in ebooks and whatever it may be under the sun when it comes to content creation. I've never had and I think it's what led us to really want to do this, be in this space of podcasting. I've never seen a medium where leadership and people outside of marketing are more skeptical up front because they're like, it's new, it's different. I'm not sure. It seems like marketing just podcasting. Maybe marketing is just going down like this weird path so they can have some fun. I don't know. Going from skepticism to legitimately loving the piece of content that the company is creating. It's this very fascinating evolution that I see with just about every one of our customers where they go from, all right, we got the green light. This has got to be good, to like fast forward 6 months. CEO loves the podcast. Sales is excited. It's just a really cool medium that these organizations, I just watch them get behind and hear stories like that. It's awesome.
I mean, it is. And to be clear, like, I think our Q squared leadership, when I first floated this idea, like, 3 months into starting as like marketing, I'm like, well, here's what we're going to do. And everyone's like, what? Like, that seems crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
And my CEO was like, so wait, you want to do this a lot? Or like, I thought you were just going to do like 1 or 2 episodes. And I'm like, no. Like, this is going to be like every other week. Like, this is going to be like the engine that like drives the ship to the promised land. But I think that part of the skepticism is like, there's initial reaction, like, do people listen to podcasts? Then there's like how are you going to measure its impact? And so I was very clear, like, look, we could look at downloads, or like, I had to like think through that. And I was like, look, we're going to create all these other assets. So like, we're going to look at the total accumulative effect of like, it's going to live on YouTube and it's going to be on LinkedIn. It's going to be all these different places. And so you could kind of show like, look, people are watching these clips. Like, we're getting thousands of views or hundreds of views. And people are listening to the audio. And so you kind of look at that full picture, and then the light bulb goes off like, oh, wow, like, yeah, this is being consumed, across a ton of different places. For me, I was very clear. Like, I was like, if we're going to measure it, I think probably like its impact, like, how many like accounts can we touch? So I was very smart to just be like, I want to focus on its impact would be like, how many guests do we get from accounts that are in a sales cycle? I crouched it in sales terms, whether I believed it or not. I like put it into those terms that I was like, this is going to help you touch more sales accounts. And so then they were like, oh, okay, well, it's going to help sales
lowest
accounts.
Common denominator.
Yeah. Then that got sales on board, and then that kind of got like the CEO off my back a little bit where, cause it was kind of like, it might not be a super crisp, measurable ROI, but like it's going to impact deals that we're working on, and that'll impact revenue, and it'll help kind of lift up all the other kind of channels and stuff we're going after. And once they started to see that and then see the quality of guests that we were getting and things like that, it was like, at some point, it's like, you can't stop. It's like, even if I wanted to, it's like, I couldn't stop now. So yeah, that is exciting to see when you're like, I don't even know if this is worth doing. But I'm going to kind of go out and take a leap of faith, and then to see it sort of work, and then see other people buy in within the company once they've seen the value that it brought. That is a really good feeling.
A great comeback or internal objection beater that you can use to a CEO or any high-ranking executive who you need to get some budget from for a podcast or just approval for is what value would you put on an hour-long conversation with either, target account, your industry's biggest influencers or subject matter experts. Have them put a dollar figure. Okay, you would put $700 towards an hour-long conversation with a target account. Awesome. That's what my per episode budget will be. Let me work within that. At least you'll start out with some money. You don't have to start from zero. Sorry.
No, well, I was going to say it's such a good way to frame it, right? Because it's like, marketing puts a value on like, a lead, cost per lead, and some of that shit, right? And in some ways, it's like astronomical. You're spending thousands of dollars, and to be like, look, actually for $0. Literally for $0, I can get you the CEO of blah, blah hospital and health system to be on, to spend an hour with me, talking about their organization and like what they're doing, and just getting a crap ton of account intel. Like, it's actually, now I'm going to use that. Like, what is that worth to you? Because I feel like that's such a great way to frame it, and I would have never thought about it in those terms, but it is true. Like, you get access to these accounts and these people that, you couldn't in a normal sales cycle get access to, and that should have a value, regardless of, whether it helps close deals or whatever. So yeah, that's awesome. I love hearing that. I'm going to steal that one too.
Take this podcast. I mean, we had, as a guest, love him or hate him, it doesn't matter. We had Gary Vee as a guest on our podcast. Gary Vee gets paid tens of thousands of dollars to make appearances. I got him for $0 to make an appearance on my podcast. That ad alone is worth thousands of dollars in the ability to have Gary come on and say, he said to camera, without me giving him $1, no payola, nothing. He's just came on out of the kindness of his heart and said, you need to be doing what the guys at Motion are doing. I'm like, man, you have no idea how much that is worth to me. And so I do think it's always funny to just ask that of executives, what would it I'm curious,
yeah.
What would it be worth? Take a target account. What would it be worth to you to have an hour-long, unfiltered conversation where they are not distracted? They are opening up to you. They don't feel like they're on a sales call, because they're not. They're creating content, and they're opening up to you about everything going on in their business for 1 hour. What is that worth?
Yeah. I love it too because do you use that Gary V clip? First of all, I love the story of how you got him on your podcast for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And but do you use that like for ads? Because the other part I was like, look, we can now also do like influencer marketing where we're like, because it's all publicly available once the podcast goes out. And these clips are on YouTube. It's like now we can use them in like ads, and it's like almost like leverage someone's like name and likeness to, if they say something like that, where it's like they are kind of putting a message into market that like we is aligned with us. You would never be able to get them to do that otherwise, in some ways. But do you, because like,
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We can use it in a variety of
Yeah.
ways. I mean, we use it as a testimonial. Again, Gary Vaynerchuk, one of the foremost, marketing voices over the last 20 years. And again, polarizing figure because half people love him and would, I've spoken to, or been on Pablo Gonzalez's podcast. And I mean, that dude flew to where Gary was going to be a few times, so they had the opportunity
Yeah.
to meet him. So you have like that level of fandom. Then you have people who may not like Gary, but it doesn't matter. And I had this guy who everybody knows for the last 20 years able to come on and say, you should be doing what these guys are doing. So there you go. I got a testimonial from this voice. Then on top of it, had him on for 25 to 30 minutes, which is a lot of time to spend with someone, who has, I think, almost 3 million followers on Twitter and all these other places. And then we have the ability to leverage that into repurposed content to drive people to our podcast as top of funnel ad content, as well as bottom of funnel ad content where you have Gary saying to go work with people like us. So that one interview was able to generate a ton of content all throughout the funnel, as well as just saying, hey, you should check out my podcast. And people are like, oh, who's been on? And I'll be like, oh, some more niche folks who have B2B podcasts like James Furbush, and he told his story, all the way up to Chris Lockhead and Gary Vaynerchuk. Yeah. And people are like, wow, that's cool. Like I could have my name alongside. And the last guy who I interviewed, he's a B2B podcaster. He was like, the main reason I wanted to come on your show is so I could tell my friends that I was on a show, just a guest, just like Gary Vee was a guest on that show. I don't care. If that makes somebody happy and gives my show more credibility, I'm all for it. And so I think what podcasting allows you to do is has this medium to break down walls, to have conversations with people you otherwise may not have had the opportunity to talk to.
Yeah, amen to that. Totally agree. Yeah, that's awesome.
So the last question I had for you is I told you I read your Winding Path bio post on LinkedIn, which I found fascinating. And I'm curious where podcasting will fit in to the James Furbush list of professional activities on the way to becoming a CMO. Where does this fit in the biopic, our biopic? Is it a big piece of your story? Is it going to be something that, set out on and it was just another marketing activity? Is it something that you're passionate about? Where does podcasting fit in this story?
I think it's going to be a big part of my story going forward. So I sort of touched upon this like early when we first started talking, which is I really wanted to, so part of it I thought was there's a ton of value from a just marketing and sales activity. And then the other part of it was I thought it was a really great way to challenge myself to just, I didn't want to pigeonhole myself as just like the person who is a copywriter or person who can only create one type of content. I really wanted to challenge myself to be a person who can really do audio and do video and think about, I've had to do like Canva, and I've designed more visual assets in my life than I've ever done. And I've, all of that is thanks to podcasting. And so now, like for me going forward in that story, someone's like, okay, well, tell me about the content you produce. And it's like, yeah, I like managed a podcast all by myself. I've done this, I've done that. So for me, like that feather in my cap, I think it's going to be a huge part of it going forward. But then I think also just, if I ever do get to be a CMO or kind of in that leadership seat, it's, it's a good thing to keep in mind that, you have to explore different ways of running business. You can't do the same thing that like every other person in your industry is doing. And so, maybe in my next role, the podcast market is saturated, but maybe that gives me the confidence to be like, well, I don't know, let's look at this TikTok thing, like let's look at right, it's like Discord or some other thing, right? That is like the next thing that, I think there is like marketers have that fine balance of like, how quickly do I jump on something versus, if I jump on it, I've jumped on it too late. And so for me, I think it's just giving me that confidence to be able to, take that leap of faith and maybe jump on something that, might not, maybe it's early in the game, but, then you can carve out that space on another medium or channel. And so for me, I think it's just been career-wise, it has brought me a level of excitement in my career that I haven't had in a very long time. And that has been invaluable over the last year of my professional and personal life where, we're all in this kind of weird environment of like daycare closures and burnout and all that stuff. So for me, it's giving me a creative outlet that's helped kind of breathe new life into me professionally. And for that, I think I can't honestly put a price on what that means to me. So for podcasting in that sense, I think it's going to be just a huge part of my story going forward.
Love that. And I think that's a good spot to end. So since we're coming up on our time here, James, where can people go to learn more about you, what you're doing at AccessOne, and on your show, the Modern Patient Experience podcast?
Yeah, you can hit me up on LinkedIn, certainly. I won't tell other people to go to our website or that, but I think, if you want to Google AccessOne, we've got a YouTube channel. You can check out the clips there. You can check us out on Spotify. We're probably where every podcast is found. And for me personally, yeah, I think just hit me up on LinkedIn, like slide into my DMs and follow me or just, reach out and connect. And I always love meeting new people. So, LinkedIn is where probably the best place you can find me. It's where I found you, Justin, right? It's like where we found each other. So,
yeah.
So yeah.
Cool. All right.
Awesome,
well,
guys.
James, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on. It was great having you.
Oh my God, Justin, thanks for having me, man. This was super fun. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.